All right, let's get ready for math. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do in our classroom that are going to set ourselves up for success. And prepping and preparing our room for math instruction is going to help us to get ready for math and make sure that we are ready to go come the first day of school. So, why should we bother to get prepared? Can't we just go into the classroom, do a few get to know you activities, and then just get started on math? Well, I've been teaching for 17 years, and one of the things that I have come to realize is that when we set up our classroom for success, we set up our math classroom for success, it's going to help us feel prepared and organized and ready to tackle all of the things that are going to be thrown our way. When we can establish things like a routine and procedure, and we have places for things and where they belong, and everything has its own place in our classroom, it's going to make the day-to-day act of teaching in math that much more simpler and easier. So we want to be as prepared as we can. Now, in the same breath, we also have to recognize that no matter how much preparation we do before we start, does not necessarily mean that we're going to be prepared for everything. This is going to be prepared for the baseline of what it is we need. So we are not feeling like we're starting and stopping from scratch every single time. So let's talk about what are the things we can do before school starts to help us get prepared for math. The first thing we're going to do is start by thinking through what our long range plans are going to be. And then we're going to decide what are some of the strategies that we're going to teach and get new ideas. Thankfully, you're here inside Camp Math for the week. So this means that we are going to go through all of these things together. In your webinar, we're going to talk all about how to craft your long range plans using a spiraled approach specifically. And then you can decide on some of the best teaching strategies as we go over why and how you should teach math. And it'll allow you to get some new ideas. So make sure that you're going to be joining us for your live webinar so that we can go through some of these in detail. If you would like a copy of our long range plans, you can grab those at our website at www.madlylearning.com. Scroll all the way to the bottom of that homepage, and there's a little image on the bottom corner that allows you to sign up for our long range plans. Here, we've done all of the heavy lifting for you and mapped out what every month of the school year could look like, including what subjects and expectations you can teach. Now, when we're talking about how we're going to teach, we're really talking here about a spiraled approach. Now, spiraling your instruction is a little bit different from traditional teaching methods where you would typically follow chapters in a textbook. In a spiraled approach, you're still going to focus on one skill in a week, but the combination of skills over a couple of weeks is going to lead to a big idea instead of, say, one strand at a time. So within a 5-week period, you might have multiple expectations from different strands that all work together to, say, solve a problem or lead to an overall big idea. Again, we're going to go through this in more detail during your webinar. So make sure you stay tuned and make sure you show up and attend those live webinars. Now, the other thing that we want to be focusing on before school starts is to look at our schedule and our timetable and what it means inside our classroom and where we're going to position math within our day. Now, if you have a full time period in which to position your school day, there are two main things that I want you to focus on planning and putting on your schedule first. One is going to be your 60-minute math block, and the other will be your 100-minute language block. Those are your two most important subjects that you want to get down on your timetable first before you put anything else on. It's important to before school starts that if there are issues with your timetable, such as you don't have uninterrupted language periods or you don't have enough for a 60-minute math block every single day, before school starts is a time for you to discuss with your principal that now is a great time to make some changes and perhaps make some switches where your prep is, see if you can swap out where your prep is, and maybe make some schedule changes if possible. Also, as an aside, I really strongly encourage you to look if you are given a schedule that tells you when you have to teach certain subjects or when your prep coverage are, and you happen to have a schedule that has a prep coverage teacher that's not responsible for a reportable subject. I highly encourage you to negotiate with that teacher to take on an element of your reportable subject matter and talk to your principal about that as well. Now, the next decision is where exactly is that math block going to go? If I have a choice, I'm always going to try to put my math block earlier in the day. The earliest I can do is possible. I do prefer having my math block right after a major transition, such as the beginning of your day as students are walking in, or I like to have it after a recess. I do this because of the routines that I establish and the structures I do in my classroom, and I want to try to make it as most consistent as possible. What I don't want is to have some math blocks starting in the middle of a block, some starting at a recess, some starting after at the beginning of the day. I want to try to keep it as consistent as possible. So ideally, I would like to have my math in the very first period of every single day, 60 minutes. And if I can't have it there, I want it after the very first nutrition break or recess time if possible. I also want you to think through some of the routines and transitions that are going to have students coming into your classroom to start your math block off, as well as what they're going to do to exit your math block. Now, even if they're staying in the same classroom, think about what it is that's going to happen within that math. If you think about who is going to be in your classroom, think about where they're going to be. How are you going to signal math has started? What will be the activity or event that will signal the beginning of math? What will signal the end of math? Then think through all of the routines and structures of where students will need to be, where they'll travel to, how they'll get materials, how they'll put materials away. Think about reducing as much as possible the amount of transition times required, the amount of movement required, and make sure that there is systems and routines that are in place here for your classroom. Try not to add too much stuff or too much gimmicky things in here, because that's just going to add a complicated amount of management to your math system that isn't necessary. Really try to keep it simple. I know that there's lots of things that you see online and we get inspired by, but every time we add a new layer of complexity into our classroom, it becomes more difficult to manage. So think of all the things you want to do and then pare it down to its most simplest basic form so that you can ensure that you have the stamina to actually maintain it after the first or second month of school, which is often where all of these routines fail because we have great ambitions at the beginning of the year, but they just can't be maintained by about November. Then next is going to be prepping your room. So as we go back into our classrooms, and I know for most of us, this isn't going to happen until the very end of the month, which shouldn't. Please don't go into your classroom earlier. If you are given the ability to, try not to do it. Enjoy your summer as much as you can. But that doesn't mean that we can't be thinking about our space and think about how you're going to plan that out and where you're going to put furniture, where you're going to put things in your classroom. I personally like to have a section of my classroom that's dedicated to math. I will want a bulletin board space and some shelving attached to that section of my classroom because math has lots of manipulatives and storage. In my language, I don't necessarily need all of that ins and outs for students to be using, but my math does require shelving because I need somewhere to store manipulatives. Your other thing to consider is maybe you don't want to have all of your manipulatives out. So consider a cart that can be put away and rolled out during math so that it is not just free for all toys during nutrition break. There are some classes that just love playing with math manipulatives when it's not math time. Think about where you're going to be storing student materials and where the subject locations will be inside your classroom. For me, when I'm planning the materials for math, I want to have all of the manipulatives inside buckets that have lids because we know that they need to have lids in our classrooms. Inside things that need kits, like my place value blocks, I like to have baggies of kits inside a bucket so students could open the bucket, take a baggie that has how much and what's labeled inside the baggie so that students can make sure that if you have a place value kit, it has all of the stuff in the place value kit. Fractions tiles also are things with kits, counters, anything that you'd have a big bucket of that you don't just want to put the big bucket of blocks right on their desks. You want to divide it up among students. It's okay to think about how you want to do kits inside these bins and buckets. And for student materials, if you're thinking you want to put in materials, my favorite materials are going to be one notebook and one duotang. Duotangs for all the loose papers, which I try not to have too many of, and a notebook so that I can use the notebook for note taking, for student activities, for student paperwork. I try to use the notebook as much as possible to reduce some of the photocopying. So even if I have an activity that looks like it could be photocopied, if there's some way I could replicate that inside a notebook, I will. Most of the time, I will use that notebook for two things. One is student work, and the other is their student reflection journal, and inquiry and scratchbook. So I may have more than one notebook for math, depending on how that works. I might take one notebook, cut it in half, and one half is going to be their math journal and the bottom half will be their workbook. So it depends on how you want to do it. I've done both where I've given them two notebooks for math, but lately my preference is half a notebook for their math journal and the other half a notebook just for their practice work and note taking inside that notebook, and then a duotang for any of their loose papers that I'm handing out. So I know that there's lots of people that have talked about notebooks, duotangs, and binders. Again, my preference is a notebook and a duotang. Every once in a while, I think about whether or not I want to do binders. I know binders work for lots and lots of people. I don't think binders work for me, or nor do I think they work for my students. I have an issue with loose paper, and I find binders paper was constantly coming out of binders. So, what I actually like to do is for some of my students to house all of their stuff is use those accordion files that you can get from the dollar store that can be sealed. And I have students use that for all of their subjects, and then they file their duotangs and notebooks inside the accordion folder so that if I am handing out any loose papers, it could simply slide into that folder and then be organized into their duotangs later. So I do really like those. A lot of my students were using those last year, and it really helped those that struggled with organization. You also need to think of the manipulatives you need, technology that you have, and label everything. I am a big fan of ensuring that everything has labels. Now, they don't have to be pretty or fancy labels. You can simply use a computer and Microsoft Word and the Microsoft Word's label feature and create some very simple labels that you can print off at home. You can just use a label and write with marker, or you can purchase the fancy looking labels that you find often on Teachers Pay Teachers. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the label looks like, but labels are helpful. So I highly recommend thinking about how you can label all of the things. The next strategy that I use to help keep me super organized is looking at my class list. Now, I am a big fan of looking at my class list, and each one of my students get a number that is associated with their position on my class list. Now, sometimes the class list numbers will change, especially if I have a big turnover. Most of the time for me, I'm not getting a huge turnover. So if I do get one or two new kids, they just slide into the end of my class list. Even though they're not in alphabetical order anymore, that's fine for me. It doesn't actually need to be in alphabetical order for your assessment purposes. So give each student a student number and make sure their materials also have their student number on it as well. This is going to help you to know where the stuff goes back to. It also will help to strategize your marking. If you can organize a group of student papers all in the same order as your class list, it makes marking go that much faster. You can have students organize work into student numbers. So if everybody puts their student number at the top of their page, you can get a student to say, here, go put these in order from 601 to 623. Now, if you are teaching, how I like to number my class is very specific. It is always going to be a 3-digit number, and the first number is going to be their grade, and the second number was their position on my class list. So if I'm teaching a 5-6, then my 5s will be labeled 501 through 508, and my 6s will be 601 through 614. If I have a straight grade, it's 601 to 626. And this way, I'm not having, everybody has a 3-digit number. The grade first number tells me what grade they're in, and the other number tells me what position they are on my class list. A 3-digit number solves a lot of problems later on when we talk about numbering. I also am going to create some generic checklists that I can quickly grab off of my desk and fill out, whether it's a check mark of students handing in pizza forms, whether it is just I'm walking around the room checking students off, making quick anecdotal notes. I'm going to create a list, just blank assessment checklists and anecdotal notes pages with my students' names already on them so that I can make sure that I am going through and I have just a blanket set of them. It is surprising how often I rely on these papers to quickly grab and check students off or make notes for students throughout the year. It saves me a lot of time to just have them, and then I can file them and do stuff with them later. Again, not only are you going to label your stuff, but you're going to label your students' stuff with their name and their student number, and you're going to use a preliminary seating arrangement as well. It's going to definitely change, but at least plan that out, and you don't even need to be in your classroom to do it. Now, if we're thinking about our routines, what are some things that we need to plan through? The first is going to be are getting started, how we're going to get our students to walk into our math classroom, what's going to happen the first 5-10 minutes. I'm a big fan of using warm-up activities. In our Ignited Math program, we have warm-up activities where you print and photocopy one page for the whole week, and they do one section every day. It should only take 5 or 10 minutes for them to complete. It's enough to have you transition them into the classroom, give them these warm-ups, and think about how else are you going to, what is going to be the routine for materials distribution? What's going to work? What's worked for you in the past and what's going to work for you in the future? I like having people at each table group responsible for materials, and that's the person who goes and gathers the materials that we need. So you have someone designated at each table group as being the materials person. That person is responsible for grabbing it. So that way you don't have people racing to all go get it. Everyone's trying to figure out who's going to go get the stuff or not. All of my students are in table groups, so we try to have a materials manager. That's the person who goes and gets the stuff that they need. The next thing I want you to focus on is how you're going to plan this transition times. There's going to be things that throughout your math block that you're going to want to signal your students to have them practice transitioning from one activity to the other. Things like, how are we going to start our math period? How are we going to transition into teacher directed time? How are we going to transition into student activities and student centers? How are you going to signal which students are going to come work with you at the guided reading table? What does that look like? What does success look like? Establishing the norms for how this works in your classroom is going to be an important part of you planning this out ahead of time. It's great to do this in the moment, but it's often easier to think through what you ideally want it to look like and then modify it as needed for your students. But this first month of school is going to be really important for you to do some forming and norming with your classroom to make sure that they understand what the signal is, what the timing is, what your timing expectations are. You're going to need to give them some time to practice and establish exactly what you want and ensure that you are reinforcing the things you want and you're not rewarding the things that you don't. The last is independent work. Now, this is always a big one, and I am a firm believer that all students have the capacity to work independently, but there's a few conditions that are required in order for that to happen. One, we need to establish very clear expectations about what independent work looks like, sounds like, feels like inside your classroom. We need to start teaching our students to rely on themselves. One of the main reasons I feel like independent work fails in our classroom is because our students aren't so great at relying on themselves for answers. So they will often just bombard the teacher with lots and lots of questions and not really have that independent ability to solve problems. This has often probably been reinforced by teachers in previous grades, or it's just something that they developmentally have not yet developed. Especially if you're working with grade 3 and 4 students, this is a skill that they're developing. So it's important that we reinforce this idea of self reliance. One of the simplest and easiest things to do is when a student comes to you with a question, don't answer it right away. Ask them what they think the answer is. When a student has to think through what they think the probable answer is, or they have to give you a couple of different options, what do you think I'm going to tell you to do? What do you think the next step would be? When you put it back on them and have them think through it, and then when they come up with a great solution, you said, that's great. See, you didn't need me to answer that question. You knew exactly what you were supposed to be doing. You're reinforcing that idea that they can work and make decisions without you constantly needing to be the only one. If you are finding within the first month or two of school that your students are constantly coming up to you with questions, it's often a need that is missing, and that need is that they're not ready to be self reliant. We also have to have some accountability, building up this accountability piece for our students. So if they're working, if you give them independent time and they're not completing the work and not using their time, how do we build in some accountability for our students? Whether we have deadlines, whether we have conversations with parents, whether we have them self-reflect and assess what they're doing, they need to know that we're paying attention about how they're using their independent time and holding them accountable and ensuring that we're talking to them about effective strategies for time management. Often, students will focus all of their time on one small task and lose sight of the bigger picture. So it's important that we have some of those social emotional learning lessons and we talk to them about what appropriate time management looks like and strategies that they can use to effectively manage their time so that they don't shut down during independent work time and get nothing completed. All of these strategies will help us to plan out what our math program can look like. And these are all things that we can think through before school even starts to ensure that we are making sure our students, we're setting them up for success. Now, your first 20 days of school is not going to be your typical normal week in your math classroom. That's because the first 20 days is really in our math class about building relationships and building students' confidence in their social emotional math skills. It's why it's an important component of our math program is talking about who they are as math students, building up their confidence and building up the strategies to allow them to be able to take risks. Math requires a lot of risk taking in our classroom. If we don't have the relationships and culture of trust and support in our classrooms, it's going to be much more difficult for you to encourage your students to take some risks in their math challenges. So we want to use this first 20 days to build relationships. It's also a key part of our year where we can have some diagnostic assessments and teach our students that they can have fun with math. Thank you so much for joining me for today's session on how to set your classroom up for success in math. If you have any questions, feel free to hop in our Facebook group and ask away. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. If you have your own tips and strategies on what you do to set up your classroom, please feel free to share in our group. Your bonus word for today's video is systems.